said the reason they came here is to seek economic opportunity. They were from France. They were called up in the French Revolution, knew a lot of people, none other than Louis XVI, who lost their heads during all of that. But by the time the terror was done, they made the decision to come over here. It was long done. So the terror is done by the mid-1790s. They make the decision in 1799. The reason to do that is to seek this economic opportunity. That Europe is in shambles at that point. They don't want to go to Britain. Where is a great place to go and set up business? You guessed it, the United States of America. One of the people who encouraged them to do that was none other than Thomas Jefferson. So the head of the family, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, got to know Thomas Jefferson when Jefferson was consul of France during the American Revolution. They found out they had a lot in common, not the least of which was how they felt about education, how they felt about the economy, how they felt about all sorts of things. So they struck up a lifelong friendship. They had a pretty hearty correspondence until Dupont de Nemours died in 1817. And they wrote to each other about absolutely everything, from geopolitics during the War of 1812 to merino sheep in Spain, which is a big economic thing for woolen mills during the late 18th and early 19th century. Dupont de Nemours even visited Monticello on a trip after they relocated to the United States. So they knew each other pretty well. Now Jefferson is not the reason they came to the United States, but he greased the gears of progress, so to speak, to get them here. An important part of the whole story, and this is going to play into the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School, the reason why we're all here today, is that the Dupont family were members of what was called the physiocratic movement in France. And how many of you have heard of the physiocratic movement in France? Good. Educational moment today. That's why we're all here, the educational moment.
Yes.
So the physiocratic movement in France was a group of folks, incredibly smart people, who met in coffee shops, salons, to discuss the matters of the day, not the least of which were economics, politics, education, that sort of thing. Their ideas were that they wanted to see a country that had an export rather than import economy and a manufacturing base. They wanted to see a country that educated its own people well. Not just a little bit, but people who were well-read, people who were literate. And of course, thanks.
I think, make sure.
Yeah.
Here we go.
That's dirty.
So part of my background is I worked for quite a while in museums and outdoor sites, so I can use my outdoor voice pretty well. And that's one of the things I do with Hagley. Often you could hear me shouting from the other side of the property, whatever I'm leading people around giving talks. So with education, you know, this is an important part of how they think, and part of this physiocratic movement that the family is a part of. This is part of the greater Enlightenment movement in Europe going on in the late 18th and early 19th century. You know, so these are ideas that they bring with them to the United States and coming here to set up shop. You know, an important point to make in all this too, and this will play back into the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School, is that whenever you think of a business like DuPont, it's typically always in a tale of ascension, right? That you start this business and it's not going to do anything but become successful. But the DuPont story in the United States is one of many failures before you reach the success. So when the DuPont family started off, they had a prospectus of 9 things they wanted to try. And it was called P.S. Dupont de Nemours, Father and Sons and Company, which I will not say to you in French. I know I will murder it, but incredibly long name. P.S. Dupont de Nemours, Father and Sons and Company. So the idea was that they wanted to try a lot of things, not the least of which was printing and publishing, which they had done in Paris. Shipping people, like physically on ships, people, mail, things like that. Also, they wanted to try land speculation. They wanted to try to sell dry goods, all sorts of things they wanted to try. Each of these businesses in turn failed, one right after the other. Printing and publishing didn't do well because there were already a lot of other people in the United States who did that. With the dry goods business they set up in New York, they had the incredible poor fortune of selling dry goods to Napoleon's army in Haiti. So whenever the Haitian Revolution didn't go France's way, the DuPont family asked for payment. The French government told them get lost. So that put that business totally out of business. If you click your way down all of these things to try, then they hit black powder manufacturing. That's the thing that sticks because that's one of the things that's not happening in the United States. But it's also one of the things that they can do well because E.I. DuPont P.S. DuPont de Nemours' second son, learned how to make black powder from a guy named Antoine Laurent Lavoisier in France. He ran the French National Black Powder Factory at Somme. The more important thing that E.I. DuPont learned in all this was not how you do chemistry or make black powder, but how you manage a business. So this is also an important part of the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School story, because it comes down to not only building a factory, but how do you build a community to go with it? Because you've got to have people. You can't run a business like that without people. That's an incredibly important part of all this. So in 1802, they purchased a piece of property just north of us on the Brandywine and get the DuPont company started. So that, after a long series of events, becomes the DuPont company that we have all come to know and love today. So the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School, this may seem like, a kind of a divergent ramble on all things that are not pertinent to the 175th anniversary of Mount Salem Church. But the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School is where all of this starts. And so one of the strands I'd like to pull through all this for you is that of community. The community is incredibly important in all this. Remember back to these French Enlightenment ideals, the way the physiocrats thought. It's all about education. It's about building this community, building a center for people to be, in addition to manufacturing. This is where these ideas take hold. E.I. DuPont got the idea to build a Sunday school. So if you've been to Hagley's property, you've probably seen the Sunday school. And if you haven't, ask one of our staff members. We'll definitely point it out to you. The building still exists. And whenever we talk to people in Delaware, usually whenever I say, I'm from Hagley, they'll say, I was there in the 4th grade and I used a quill pen in the school. And that's typically where people remember all this, is going to the school. But the idea for the school actually goes back to the 1780s in Great Britain. There's a fellow named Joseph Rakes who figures out that there's a lot of people who work in manufacturing in Britain who are not in any way educated. And he wants to see that change. In part because it's a way to get more educated workers. You get more out of the workers in your respective manufactories if you have people who are educated. But also a part of this is a sense of social responsibility. So you have people that do have a bit of privilege, and they feel like because they have privilege, they should share that. They should push that on to these people who may not have the same privilege as they do, to share the wealth, so to speak. And if I'm educated, I should help you be educated. And the idea with it being a school that comes out of these ideas is to specifically work with people who are employees of mills. So a manufacturer's Sunday school. Most of us now think of Sunday school as where you go on Sunday before you go to your regular church service and you hear Bible lessons. The original idea for this type of Sunday school was it's a school literally held on Sundays, because that's the only day you're not working. So that's the only day you have available to get educated. And this is not just for kids, it's for adults as well. So these get set up in manufacturing centers in Great Britain, and it becomes the model for what moves to the United States. So there's a person who attended some of these schools in Britain who ends up in a cotton manufacturing mill, a place called the Simsville Mill, which is Walker's Mill on the Brandywine now. So if you've been on the Brandywine, one of the most picturesque places, one of the most photographed mills in all of Delaware, and that's Walker's Mill. That's just up here by the post office at Breck's Mill, so just across the stream. So he tries to set up a Sunday school there to teach people on Sundays to read, write, do basic arithmetic who are working in these mills. So by 1805, this is a pretty big manufacturing center that Wilmington, Delaware actually rivals Philadelphia throughout most of the 19th century for industrial and economic output, which may seem kind of beyond the pale today, but that was an important part of 19th century America. There were mills almost continuously from Market Street here in Wilmington all the way up to the Pennsylvania-Delaware state line. So you have kind of a unique position where a lot of manufacturing can center in one place. But you've also got a lot of people working in these mills who are not educated, or at least educated to the point where these folks feel like they ought to be. So they feel like these folks ought to be able to read, they ought to be able to write, they ought to be able to do basic math, that sort of thing. Now, an important part of all this is there's a missions aspect to it as well, because the Rakes School, is a Christian-based Sunday school. It's a non-denominational Sunday school, and that's part of the point of all this, is they realized that in trying to manufacture or trying to educate manufacturers, the workers in these places, that you're going to get a wide variety of religious backgrounds. You're probably going to get, especially in Britain, Church of England, some Presbyterian folks who are involved with this, maybe a few Catholics thrown in. So if you have a sectarian mission, you're going to turn off all the people who aren't listening to your story coming to these schools. And that's not the point. The point of all this was to use like Bible verses, use writings, Christian writings of some sort, to try to teach these people reading and writing skills, and again get them into basic math. So there's the missions aspect. They want to try to lead people to faith, but they also, more importantly, want to lead them to education. That you can get them into education and lead them out to faith from there. So that's part of how all this starts and how it gets embedded in some cases with some churches in the area. So Elliott and E.I. DuPont, who starts the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School, hears that there's one going on in the Simsville Mill and wants to check it out. He, listening to a lot of his father's teaching, remember back to the physiocrats, education, economy, all these important bits, wants there to be something like that on the Brandywine, thinks this is a great idea, goes down to Simsville and sees it, takes to the idea. So this is about 1815, whenever he's seeing this and bringing it all together. Pretty soon that school was so big, it outgrew the small room they had it in Simsville. E.I. DuPont invited them to move the school to the Henry Clay Mill, which is now Hagley's Visitor Center. That mill was originally a cotton spinning mill that the DuPont company invested in around the War of 1812. So he essentially owned that building and said, okay, set up in here. They realized that they're going to have a bigger space because of the critical mass of people, because there were so many mills on the Brandywine, such a need for education in that era. How do you do this? So in 1816, E.I. DuPont decides he's going to build a school and put it on the DuPont company property and push this from the DuPont company's perspective. It's also important to point out that E.I. DuPont himself was, and I would describe him more as a spiritual deist than necessarily a religious person. And I know we can debate the ins and outs of that all day long, but every impression that you get from him, and he, as he said of himself, was more of a deist. That he believed in a higher power, but he's not going to proselytize or hit you over the head with any particular sectarian vision. And so the idea of a non-sectarian Sunday school spoke well to him. This is something that he's like, wow, this is a great idea. This really speaks to all of my teachings, everything that the family is involved with. This is, I think, a great idea for the workers who are here. So he starts to get involvement with the community. Reaches out to other mill owners. Hey, this is a great idea. Should you invest in this? I think you should. And we're starting a subscription list. So other manufacturers in the area start kicking in money, E.I. DuPont kicking in the most. So they decide that they're going to move forward with this and start construction on the building, which is on our property, in 1816. But not only does he want to start this building, even start the school, but he wants to have the official sanction of the state of Delaware to do it. So actually gets a charter from the state of Delaware to open the school, which was officially chartered in January 1817. So you have the official sanction of the state of Delaware that you are a fully licensed, operable school recognized by the General Assembly of the state of Delaware. So this is an important part of this larger process. So in October 1817, the building is completed. The students start meeting there on Sundays to learn reading, writing, and basic math. Now there's a couple of strands that I'm going to pull through all of this story with you. And community is the most important one. And his daughter, who plays an important part in all of this, Victorine DuPont Bedouin, is a really important person in this whole story. That she had recently lost her husband, a fellow named Peter Bedouin, or rather Ferdinand Bedouin. His father was Peter Bedouin. They had been married a month when this fellow unfortunately died. She was absolutely heartbroken. So E.I. DuPont thought that, well, maybe a way to get her to rejoin the community, a way to help her heal, is to get her into the school to help teach. She didn't start off as the headmaster, but ended up being the headmaster for most of her life. So this is a way for him to help bring his daughter again into this community and to help her with the healing process. And it ended up being something that she took well to. She didn't have any children, she never remarried, but ended up becoming a main player in the school and pushing it along all the way up to her death in 1861. So through that, she brings in two of her sisters, Elliott DuPont and Sophie DuPont, who become teachers in the school and later superintendents of the larger project in their own right. So the DuPont family is neck deep in this whole idea of the school and everything that's going on with it. So education is an important thing in the state of Delaware. Delaware is one of the first states in the Union to actually pass an education law. So they did that in 1829, providing for public schools. It's important to say that the state of Delaware didn't make attendance compulsory until the early 20th century. So you've got a long lag time between 1829 and the early 20th century before kids are actually required to go to school. But getting the official charter from the state of Delaware was important because that firmly put the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School within the context of these public schools in the state of Delaware. So it's one that's officially recognized, as a school under the state system. Kind of, but not really. It's something that's officially recognized, but it's not part of the state system. So keep that in mind too, that there's a method to the madness of how this is all put together, to make it this official thing that's recognized. This is not just a cutesy little thing that somebody's doing for a hobby, that they're actually doing it for a real center of education and community. Now, the Sunday school, as we've already mentioned, only happens on Sundays because that's the only day that workers have off of work. What do you do with this building the rest of the week? So you've got this building sitting right in the middle of the DuPont company property that's going to get used for something. What do you do with it? And that's where we pull Mount Salem back into this larger discussion. So where we are on the Brandywine is not that far from the center of Wilmington, not by today's standards. But in the early 19th century, it's almost a lifetime away. A lot of the churches in the area being centered down closer to what's now Rodney Square that are further down in the city of Wilmington. So in order for someone who works around here to get there, that's a long walk. Don't forget the trolley line didn't come here until a whole lot later, not until the 1880s. So you can't just get on a trolley and go down to Wilmington. And so you've got to walk there, you've got to find somebody to take you there. So you have the problem of growing communities of people here on the Brandywine that want to go to church somewhere and don't have a place to go. Along with the growth of DuPont comes 5 separate workers' communities that spring up around the property. So you have ones that are all around. There's several, one that's right in the middle of our property that's near where the Sunday school exists. It was called Free Park Lane, also colloquially called Flea Park Lane, which is supposed to be a comment on the people who live there. But there's also groups of houses that are up near where our library building is currently located, so it's on this extreme upper end of the property. Some that are on the other side of the river, some that are now under what's the Tyler-McConnell Bridge. There was a thriving community there called the Henry Clay P.O. And there were ones that extended all the way down to around the experimental station. DuPont also got into the business of bringing a lot of people to Wilmington from Ireland. And how this works out is that DuPont needed labor. And not that they felt that people from Ireland were particularly the people to have. How this all works out is that there was a great deal that they could get with a shipping merchant, a transport agent in Philadelphia to get people from Great Britain to the United States. And it just so happened that a lot of people wanted out of Ireland around the same time as this whole shipping, or this whole people movement idea got going. So you end up with a lot of people from Ireland who live and work right here. So you get a growing critical mass of people who are Irish Catholic or Irish Protestant that are right around the power yards. You also have native-born Americans that are coming in. You have people from Britain that are coming in. People from all over the Mid-Atlantic coming to work for the DuPont company, landing right here. So E.I. DuPont has no problem, again being a non-sectarian, with letting people use the building. So how does all that work? How do you get churches that start out of all this? That with the Catholic Church, the Diocese of Wilmington realized that you've got to reach out to these people who are a little bit beyond the pale, so to speak, so they start sending a priest out to hear Mass or to give Mass and use the Sunday school building as the place to do it. And so with the Methodist Church, the Methodists are famous for the circuit riders and having this outreach, this robust outreach program that goes all the way to the 18th century. That's one of the things that's happening here in the 19th century. So you get these riders that will go to the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School, set up when the school's not in session, and do church services. The same thing with the growing Presbyterian group that's around, and a growing Episcopalian group that's around. So you get these critical masses of people, and what follow along are these critical masses of parishioners, so to speak, people who want to go to these churches and are forming congregations. Now remember back to this idea of community, these growing communities. One of the things that has struck me in a big way, and people usually pick out within about 2 minutes that I'm not from Delaware, is that there's strong community identity in Wilmington, Delaware. You know, that I come from Western North Carolina, and there's strong community identity there too. And one of the things I've appreciated about coming from small town North Carolina to Wilmington is this kind of community rootedness. You know, that you meet all these people that have such a strong identity to the thing that they're associated with. So here, there's the huge Irish community, there's a huge Italian community, that there's the Polish community that does the Polish festival. You know, you can name all the different groups that are here. You know, the ones that intersect with us the most at Hagley are the Irish community and a lot of the Italian folks that are around, because they're so close literally, but they also have their genesis in the DuPont communities. You know, and it's kind of a funny thing, you know, coming from Western North Carolina, we are all almost to a person German or English of some sort, Scottish English. So you have a strong Presbyterian presence, a strong Methodist presence, and a strong Lutheran presence. And you know, that's kind of how everybody identifies. So it seemed like a very interesting thing to come here and see the same sorts of things realign around the Irish community, the Italian community, and all the churches that come out of that. You know, so that's a big part of what's going on here. So as you get this growing critical mass of people, a growing critical mass of congregations, the time comes in the 1840s when they make the decision, well, it's time to split off and start our own churches. So beginning in the 1840s, that's when you get the split off of St. Joseph's on the Brandywine Roman Catholic Church. That's when you get the split off of Mount Salem, where we all are today. You get the split off of Greenville Presbyterian. And the last holdout is Christ Church Christiana 100, the Episcopalian Church. So what's happening simultaneously with the growth of these churches is the decline of the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School. So as these churches are splitting off, often a lot of their parishioners, their congregants go with them. So with the creation of St. Joseph's, they also create a parochial school in which the Catholic kids end up going to the Catholic school. The same thing happens with a lot of these other groups. They go to their own Sunday schools rather than a non-denominational one. So as time moves on, it ends up by the 1850s, the last standouts or the last holdouts in this building are Christ Church Christiana 100. And they stayed there until 1856, whenever their building, which is close to the Hagley property, was completed. So that building stayed the Sunday school for Christ Church Christiana 100 all the way up until 1899. And that's whenever they built their own building on their property further up the hill. But by 1856, the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School, as it was, ceased to exist. You know, so there's no school there for these people. But also by that point, the churches themselves are taking on the responsibility of their own communities, their own people, educating them, giving them this basic reading, writing, basic math skills. That's where a lot of this is coming from, are the church schools, in addition to the growing public schools within the state of Delaware. So this is an important thing going on, getting this critical mass of people and building these communities, and also the social responsibility that the people in charge feel toward the people who are working with them, working for them. I came to Delaware as a researcher in American business and industrial history. So my background is in textile mills in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And if you know anything about textile mills in North Carolina, the labor problems there are just absolutely terrible. It's huge, terrible one, just absolutely atrocious labor problems, absolutely atrocious race problems, everything you could think of. And so that's my frame of reference looking at business. And so I came to Delaware prepared to absolutely hate DuPont, and absolutely prepared to hate all the other businesses on the Brandywine. But you get into the story, and it complicated the way I think about all this stuff. And I will not dare say that DuPont is blameless over time. I wouldn't dare say that any business is blameless over time. But what you see with some manufacturers is this, again, social responsibility. So helping the people who work for them to try to have a better place in life, because they feel it's their responsibility as someone of privilege to help these other people along. And as I have researched this more, I found that there are a lot of other people who do that in the United States. Now, the game changes in a big way once you get into the 20th century, and of course it's not everybody. I mean, we can debate this idea all day long as well, but I would like to push all of you to think about this, looking at these businesses and the people who run these businesses and their place in the larger communities in which they are situated, but then also all of the other pieces of the community in which they're situated. So back to the story of DuPont. Once the congregations decide they want to split off from the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School, where do you build a building? How do you go about doing that? You got to raise a lot of funds. So guess who steps in to help build buildings for a lot of these churches? E.I. DuPont de Nemours Company, which is a fascinating thing to me because the very first person to run the company, E.I. DuPont, remember I would describe him as a spiritual deist. The next person to run the company, Alfred Victor DuPont, was an avowed agnostic and was pretty vocal about being an avowed agnostic. And the next person to run the company, Boss Henry DuPont, was an even more avowed agnostic than him. And so his daughters and his sisters all badgered him to the end of his life that he should be going to church, particularly to Christ Church Christian 100, where all the rest of them went. But he steadfastly refused, but had zero problem investing company funds into building these churches, supporting these communities, allowing his carpenters, stonemasons to make repairs on these churches to go out and do this work. And so on the face of things, you would think, well, you've got this guy who hates religion, but he doesn't. That's not what's going on. He makes a choice for himself, but he's not making the choice for everybody around him. And that's a really important distinction to make in all this, is that he felt that social responsibility to help support these communities, and that he himself said over and over again, and all the other people in the family too in the 19th century, if I'm going to ask somebody to work for me doing something that is incredibly dangerous, I need to do something for them, because they could be killed at any moment. Black powder, it's an explosive. It could kill you, and you're gone. And that happened many times. And Henry DuPont, who ran the company the longest, spoke over and over again about how distraught he was when people died on his watch, that the company was nutty about safety. And so there's over 200 explosions at the powder mills here on the Brandywine from 1802 all the way up until the powder yards closed in 1921. Most of them not fatal because of the safety procedures put in place. And I see a few people out here shaking their heads. If you've been in any way associated with the DuPont company over time, you know that safety is one of the most nutty things they have, and it goes all the way back to the very beginning. So that's part of the larger corporate program. But it's about, of course, not blowing up your factory and losing money, but just as importantly, it's about not blowing up your people. Because you don't want to destroy this community. These are the people who you work with, people who work for you. And again, there is this kind of sense of the responsibility to these people. Now, make no mistake, in the 19th century, you're not going to go to Henry DuPont's house and eat supper with him. He's not going to take you on a walk down the Brandywine, take you in his carriage to the doctor's office. That's not how this works. This idea of responsibility. Nothing like a comic interlude. But this idea of responsibility, I know that's closely tied to the concept of paternalism. So you could easily say, well, of course these people were acting in this way because they want to get the maximum amount of labor out of the people working for them. Sure, there is an element of that. I don't deny that at all. But one of the things that's been studied quite heavily in American business and industrial history is how whenever you get these factories that start, the people who are heavily involved with starting them and stay involved with operating them have a dog in the fight of the people who work for them. So let's bring this back to this community again. You have a dog in the fight of the community in which you exist, because they support you, you support them. It is a symbiotic relationship, that these people know what's what. If the people who work for you don't like you, they think that you're going to let them get blown up at every corner, that you're not going to support their activities, their churches, their lives, their communities, do you think they're going to work for you long? And people do vote with their feet. They most absolutely vote with their feet. So with a lot of these industries on the Brandywine, it doesn't become a sell your soul to the company store sort of situation like you get with coal mines, that they never want to try to make people so in debt to the company they can't get away. So a lot of people do leave DuPont for various reasons, and they were free to do so. And a lot of the other manufactories that are here on the Brandywine, but if you make it a community in which people want to stay, people will. And one of the things that has impressed me over time is just how many people I meet who say, I'm from here. Where are you from before that? Well, Londonderry in Ireland, that I came over, my family came over because of DuPont bringing people over. Or that I came here from Italy and my folks worked, they lived up on Squirrel Run and worked for DuPont, and so now, live out in Wilmington, that there's such a strong tie to this community, and that has just impressed me to no end. But a lot of it comes back to these strong ties, these communities that have been built out of the DuPont communities, but out of what was the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School, and then all of the churches that came out of that. So the idea that I want to leave you with today is that of community, that this is what this is all about. That you can tell a complex story of manufacturing, about economics, about labor, about religion, everything that you want to, but what it all comes back to in the end is this concept of community, that's the thing that binds all of these folks together. And that's the thing that bound them together in 1817, whenever the Brandywine Manufacturers Sunday School got going, all the way until now. So, that's why we're all here today, right? We're all part of this larger community. That we're all here because of Mount Salem's 175th anniversary. That's why we all are going to the churches we go to, that we're part of the communities that we're part of, that we're all drawn back to that in a way. So the thing that I want to leave you with here is, take the lesson from history, leave it better than you found it, so to speak. Take the lessons that history gives you. It's not all bad, but take the bad and learn from it. Take all these ideas that you see and think about them, internalize this, figure out, what can we do to make our communities better? What's worked and what hasn't? How can we replicate this? Because that's what we need to keep these communities together and keep them moving forward in the future. So that's me kind of giving my prognostications as a historian to you here today. And if you would like to chat a little bit, questions, comments, get into a discussion, well, shall open the floor for that now. Thank you all for coming out on a beautiful Sunday.
Thank you.
I'll use your outside voice. Mine doesn't last long, but a couple minutes. Just want to thank Lucas for coming. I don't see him very often, but he's a good friend. At least that's my evaluation. Good to have you here, and good to hear that story again. And yes, any questions to him or comments about the whole morning as far as that goes? Yes.
Sure, I have a question. Where did Joseph Bancroft and Sons enter into all of this? Because my father worked there, and I lived in the mill home. I'm just curious.
So the question is, how did Joseph Bancroft and Sons come into all of this? So they start a textile finishing business right about, or just below where the art museum currently is, and that's running by the 1840s. So that gets its own critical mass of people by the 1850s, 1860s, and just as DuPont's expanding upstream, Bancroft is also expanding down here. And it starts to fill in that part of the Brandywine. And so by the mid-20th century, that's a tremendous factory that goes from that, I can't remember the name of the housing development that's just there by the state park, where it's just below the experimental station, that it's spanned from there all the way down almost to
Rockford and Kentmere.
Yeah, Rockford and Kentmere. It goes quite a ways down the Brandywine for what a large complex that is. Now the Bancroft family are part of kind of their own social movement that they come from Britain. And so their pattern that they lay on, especially for things like the art museum, the housing that they set up in the parks, is based on the British model. And they are thinking about it in terms of, there's a big literature on this of bettering your people through green space. And that's not how they would have said it, but that's what it amounts to. Is if you make parks, that Frederick Law Olmsted was part of this large movement, Central Park in New York, that this is all part of this larger program of making parks for workers to be a part of, and that there's the coercive part, because it's like if they're out running around the park, they don't have energy to get in trouble at night. But if they have this green space, if they have access to cultural institutions, then they're going to become better people and more solid and stable workers. So there's its own program that's associated with the Bancroft Company that's separate from what's going on with DuPont.
Thank you.
Hmm? Yeah, but it's still part of these larger communities. They all get intertwined, particularly in the last quarter of the 19th century. Yes.
What was causing the Irish to want to emigrate out of Ireland and come work for DuPont? Was the potato famine at that point? What was pushing everybody to want to leave Ireland?
What was the question?
So the question is, why would the folks want to leave Ireland to come work for DuPont? You know, was it the potato famine and other things going on? The first folks to start leaving, the first folks to start arriving here from Ireland in mass came in the 1820s. So that predates the famine by just a little bit. A lot of them are just seeking opportunity, particularly religious opportunity, folks that are trying to get out of, like with the Catholic communities, that they're trying to get out of Ireland at that point. Then you get the potato famine that comes after that, and then you just get a lot of people coming out. You also get a lot of people coming out of Ulster. So a lot of former Scots that come through Ulster and then come to the United States from there. You know, so the whole Scotch-Irish group that comes out. You see a little bit of mix of everybody, and there's not like a particular reason that they all leave, but you get a whole variety of reasons why they decide that they want to come over, and a lot of them it's for no other good reason than they want to come to the United States and seek opportunity. If you've not seen it, I would highly recommend the book called Black Powder, White Lace by Margaret Mulrooney, which is specifically about the Irish communities associated with the DuPont powder yards. This book came out, I think, around 2003, somewhere around there, but it's being reissued by the University of Delaware Press this year. So within a couple of months, you can have a completely updated and revised edition of this. And her work is fantastic. A lot of the research was done out of the research collections that are at Hagley and other local records, particularly from like St. Joe's on the Brandywine, the Catholic Diocese of Wilmington records that are up there. Because a lot of the birth, death, marriage records, that's where those reside, and then out of the church records that are available in the area too. Yeah, but you see a whole variety of reasons why folks from Ireland come to specifically Wilmington, Delaware. Yes?
Why did the Polish community come to be? My last name's Oleski, which is why I'm interested in that, but I hadn't really thought about them being affiliated with the DuPont company.
So the question is, how did the Polish community come to be?
Who did they work for?
So you get a lot of folks from Eastern Europe, that kind of area, like with Ukraine, Poland, kind of that general part of the world, who come here as part of larger migrations to the United States in the later part of the 19th century. So a lot of the folks from Eastern Europe didn't specifically work for DuPont. They were part of a larger immigration movement, but you do see a lot of folks who did work for DuPont. That they come in, that most folks that came in from Italy started in right after the American Civil War, and their critical mass was in the 1870s. And right on the heels of that, you see a lot of folks that are coming from Eastern Europe. And you see the beginnings of that actually in the 1840s, and a lot of the revolutions going on in Europe at that point.
Right.
A lot of migration that starts then, but it doesn't really go in earnest until a little later on in the century. You know, but specifically for here, it's part of that larger migration pattern. Yes, sir.
Where did they have the gunpowder mills at in Delaware?
Yeah, so the question is, where were the gunpowder mills located here in Delaware? That's right here on the Brandywine. Whenever you go to the bottom of the hill here, literally the bottom of the hill here, where the experimental station is located, that was where the black powder mills ended. And if you go up 2.5 miles of the Brandywine, the factory stood on about 2.5 miles of the Brandywine. So when you come to visit Hagley today, part of what you're seeing is what's left of the gunpowder mills.
Okay.
Lucas, it was close enough that our bell tower got lowered a couple times because of the blasts.
Yes. Yeah, so one of the things that, remember back to over 200 explosions in the power yards, that there were a lot of explosions that shook everybody around this community. So here's your fun fact for the day, that nobody in the 19th century would insure a black powder factory. Surprisingly enough, I mean, well, who's going to sell insurance to a gunpowder manufacturer? So the DuPont company had to self-insure. So on their books, they carry a line called profit and loss, which if you look at 19th century accounting could mean just about anything. You don't see standardized accounting in the United States until a lot later in the 19th century. So what DuPont used the profit and loss line for is self-insurance. So they would take extra money at the end of the year, put it into that line. Every time there was an explosion, they used that money to rebuild the things that got blown up. So often, if a community member's house was hurt, destroyed in some way, DuPont would send their carpenters, rock masons, glaziers out to fix your windows, repair things that got blown apart. You know, that was just part of what happened. In 1854, about 40,000 pounds of black powder went off on Market Street down in Wilmington and almost leveled the city block.
Oh, gee.
And DuPont ended up rebuilding practically everything that got blown up because of that. But they also got banned from shipping black powder through the center of the city of Wilmington. So
the DuPont Road got named.
Yep, DuPont Road. So the DuPont company had a shipping wharf up at Edgemoor on the Delaware River. At this point, they bought one on the Christina River and built a road that went completely around the city of Wilmington so that they didn't have to go through the center of Wilmington to get there. So that's the start of the Christiana Wharf, but then also, or the Christina Wharf rather, but then the DuPont Road, which is still around today. It's well within city limits now, but in 1854, it was just outside city limits. That way they wouldn't break the ordinance by taking powder wagons. Yes.
Am I remembering it correctly? I was a little kid who went to a tour out there at Hagley's, and they showed us the three-sided buildings facing the Brandywine. So when they blew up, most of the blast would go that way. And didn't they say something about the seats that the workers grinding the powder, did it have like one leg or something so they couldn't fall asleep?
No, there's lots of stories about that. So another fun fact about the powder mills is that whenever all that machinery ran, nobody was in the building with it. So all of the machinery in the DuPont factory was actuated from the outside. And the idea is that you go inside, do what you need to do. Everybody goes out of the building, then you turn the machines on. And so you're looking through a blast wall. So whenever you come and take a tour of Hagley today, you see these powder mills. If you look at it from the side, it's like a trapezoidal shape. So it's high at the back, low at the front. There's a light roof and a light front, and it faces the river. And the idea is if there's an explosion, it blows it out into the river rather than back up into the factory.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll also notice if you take a tour, all the buildings are spread out. So it's a narrow site, but it's a long one. And the idea is that it's harder for an explosion to go that way rather than that way, so to speak. So instead of blowing it back into the factory, it channels it out in the river and it won't communicate to other buildings. But one of the euphemisms that powder workers had, that if you got blown up, they called it going across the creek. You know, that's something a lot of people here have heard a lot about. But part of the safety program is that you couldn't, they had a yard foreman that would walk around and make sure you didn't fall asleep. You know, not the least of which was Boss Henry, who would come through on his wagon and make sure that everybody was doing the right thing. That the whole idea of having a chair with a leg missing, or a chair with a leg missing, or like a stool with one leg, that way people couldn't fall asleep. I've heard stories about that, but never seen anything to prove it. But if you fell asleep on the job, they turned you out pretty quickly. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough how safety is a huge, huge thing with the folks that work there. One of the things that has stuck with me over time, speaking to that, is that I am neck deep in a book about Boss Henry and about the DuPont company's actions, reactions during the American Civil War. You get into a wartime production setup, and you're going 24 hours. So the chance of having an explosion goes up exponentially whenever you're running 24 hours, because there's a lot of wear and tear on machinery that the DuPont company built into their whole process of having downtime every year. You know, so whenever you're in the wintertime, there's a lot of ice, you can't run the mills. You take the machines apart, put them back together again, that you are constantly looking at them, doing maintenance. You can't do that when you're running a 24-hour production schedule to meet wartime demands. So there's a lot of explosions that went on. And so one of Henry DuPont's daughters mentioned how there was a particularly bad explosion in 1863, and that you could hear, as they said, the cries of the powder yard workers who lost family in that explosion. You know, from the main house at Hagley, the Eleutherian Mills Mansion. And the daughters talked about how Boss Henry would go into his office and lock himself in and cry because he was so upset that these people died on his watch and there wasn't anything he could do about it. that despite all the safety they tried to put into place, everything that they tried to do, that it still happened, and it hurt him that much that went on. So that it's an interesting story, the ins and outs of these people, kind of who they were in their relationship with their workers. Again, you're not going to have supper with Boss Henry, but he knew them all by sight. And definitely knew their names, knew all their children, knew who their families were, because he was born there in 1812 and died there in 1889. That was his life, and he knew a lot of these people because he grew up with them. So back to community, I can't say that enough.
How the heck do you remember all this stuff? You got some kind of drug addiction?
He's just 40 years younger than we are. That's
I'm just wondering,
Well, part of it is I live with Deb DuPont's more than I do my own family.
Oh, okay.
I'm practically swimming in this stuff. But it's an interesting story.
Yeah.
That's part of.
It's an interesting.
Keep reading. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for sticking in with us today. Especially on a beautiful afternoon. And shameless plug, come visit Hagley. Thanks again, everyone.
Okay.
That was Lori.